Irish Nation, the selection committee's work is complete. The bracket is set. Your Notre Dame Fighting Irish come in at number 5 in the rankings, number 7 in the seeding. We're here today to discuss all things playoff scenario. But Mike, before we get into that, I'll cover a little bit of the shows and segments we're planning to do here over the playoff season. What was your reaction to a really great college football weekend? Understood Notre Dame was idle, not playing in any of the conference championships, but some really great football. Curious, what did you take away from the day?
I think it's great if you just look at where we were after NIU, where there was a lot of uncertainty that we were going to even have a moderately successful season. I think at that point we were wondering, oh crap, this looks like a situation where the walls could be caving in. Was Marcus Freeman the right person? And then since then, it went about as well as it possibly could have. So well, in fact, that going into this weekend, we knew we were guaranteed a home playoff game, which was the goal at the beginning of the year. So even despite that really, really bad loss, we were able to get to our goal that we wanted, that we had established at the beginning of the season. So I think connecting that to this weekend, we were able to just sit back and really not be that stressed about the outcomes. Like certainly there were seeding implications and certain paths to the semis that we were looking at, but there wasn't, I wouldn't say we had any existential dread where we were sitting around wondering, oh, if this happens, maybe we don't get a home playoff game, or if this happens, maybe we don't even get into the playoff. So we could sit back and watch these games and enjoy them a little bit more. And they were, look, they were good games. I mean, there were some games that were blowouts, but the SEC championship,
Instant
sloppy,
classic.
very sloppy, but definitely a very classic game. It was fun to watch. I mean, all my group threads from back home, I'm from SEC territory, they were just popping off basically. And then look, the Big Ten championship, that was also another exciting game. And then also the ACC championship. It looked like Clemson was going to blow out SMU, but then SMU came back. So look, the late slate of games were really fun to watch. And I think not having to be worried about these existential threats that I was talking about, I think allowed me to enjoy the games more. Now, like I said, of course, I was thinking about the seeding implications and how it's going to impact Notre Dame. But I think just as a fan, it was fun to be able to just have some popcorn, down a couple beers, and just enjoy some good football.
I'm glad you just said only a couple of beers for you. I can't say it was just a couple for me, but I was pulling out. We were in Austin, Texas a long time ago now, and we got like a very random Texas like Longhorn koozie, and I was pulling that out. It's in here in Atlanta, and I work with a ton of Georgia alumni, and of course Notre Dame fans were pulling for Texas, didn't pull it out.
Yeah.
But I was treating that, just like, I don't know, it was awesome college football as a fan. So we're really excited here for Irish Talk. Lot more relevant content to cover in the next month. So we've planned out probably 6 or 7 shows that we're going to do between now through the IU game and after that, covering things like season grades, of course, looking ahead to the IU matchup, but also looking at like, how does Notre Dame stack up in the field? Can we win it all? Can we, what are the reasons why we could hit a stumbling block? What are the reasons why we could work through this? So a lot of really fun content. We had signing day a week ago. There's some coaching rumors out there that I think are very much in the, like, Marcus Freeman's not going to Ohio State. Marcus Freeman's not going to be the head coach of the Bears. But what about Al Golden and Mike Denbrock? So we're going to look at some coaching rumors and places where we've seen Notre Dame names swirling. So a lot of good postseason content coming your way. We're going to fire these out in shorter 1-segment shows, probably a few a week. So be on the lookout for that. Subscribe, download, leave us a review. We haven't really advertised that too much this year, but spread the word. Really, really helps us when you go and click that subscribe button and get those automatic downloads, or leave us, a nice 5-star holiday review would, of course, be pleasant. But today, the one thing we're going to talk about is the playoff scenarios. Did the committee get it right? How does it impact Notre Dame? How does it impact other teams? And Mike, I'll kick it off. This was admittedly a really big bummer for Notre Dame. We have one of the toughest draws in the college football playoff with the way the seeding worked. We're number 3 in the AP poll, number 5 in the college football playoff polls. And we knew that if Penn State kept it close against Oregon and Georgia upset Texas, both of which happened, that this would be a potential possibility where it'd kind of be a flip of the coin of, is Notre Dame 5, 6, or 7? Where do we stack up with Penn State? in Texas. And of course, that's here exactly what played out. Notre Dame slips to number 7. We didn't get those games to go our way. The one big upside to all of this is with Clemson, SMU playing such a close game, the committee decides that SMU stays in, Alabama stays out. I think that would have been the hardest draw statistically for Notre Dame in the first round. And so, we're going to dive into some questions that talk about why this is such a tough path for Notre Dame. But Mike, for starters, what are your overall thoughts? Like you said it, we're still hosting a home game. I think for me, this was more about optimizing our path in the playoff. But what's your kind of overall takeaway? Just saying, hey, Notre Dame 7 in the playoffs with a home game.
Yeah, I think you hit on a lot of this. I mean, I even mentioned this in some of my intro comments. So there weren't these existential threats, but I think every Notre Dame fan was hoping that we would get a draw where we get the 5 seed, where we get a very favorable matchup against like a group of 5 conference champion, or not even necessarily group of 5, but like the weakest conference champion who's definitely not a top 12 team. And then the next round you get the weakest team that got a bye. So that was kind of the dream scenario, and we obviously didn't get that. But I think overall, as I mentioned, we're still sitting in a pretty good spot relatively. We don't have the easiest path that we were hoping for, but we still have the 6th best title odds per The Athletic. And that doesn't mean that we're the favorite, obviously, but it means that we do have a puncher's chance at making some noise. And any team that we play against, like we definitely have a shot at winning. And in fact, in this first round, we should be favored by a pretty healthy margin. So I think it's right to be bummed, but it's also important to kind of keep a perspective about where we were earlier in the season and where we are in the grand scheme of things in this playoff. So it's not the best possible scenario, but overall, it's still I think we're still in a pretty decent position. And if this team is capable of winning a national championship, and if in fact they elevate at the right time and continue to grow, and if they are a team that actually can win the whole thing, then look, you'd like an easier path, but if you think you're the best, potentially the best team in the country, you should be able to go out and win these games. At some point, you have to prove it against tougher competition, and if that's against Georgia in the second round, I mean, I can't think of a better way, a better statement than to knock off a perennial title contender.
Absolutely. 6th best odds, both according to the Athletic and Vegas. And there's a really big drop off after us. There's a really, pretty clear bifurcation of those 6 teams being Oregon, Georgia, Ohio State, Texas, Penn State, Notre Dame. And then after that, Tennessee's odds, Clemson's odds, much more in the long shot territory. And so I thought you said it really well. We got to puncher's chance. This is a glass half full podcast. Like, we got to go out and prove it and, win 4 football games and bring home a title. I've spent a lot of time thinking, I was really bummed today, but very importantly, not about the committee. I thought the committee, by and large, got it right. And we're going to spend some time on why the structure is so messed up in this college football playoff with the automatic buys. And when we get down to splitting hairs on should an 11-1 Notre Dame over an 11-2 Penn State over an 11-2 Texas, and their second losses were all by way of losing in classic conference championship games, incredibly competitive against some of the best teams in the sport, you're really splitting hairs at ranking 5, 6, 7. Of course, I got the arguments for why Notre Dame should be 5. Like, who did Penn State beat? Doesn't the head-to-head matter with Penn State and Ohio State, who now have the same number of losses? Like, I get all of that. But you're splitting hairs. If you're talking about SMU versus Alabama for that last spot, well, guess what? Alabama had their chance and lost 3 times. Also, SMU had their chance and lost to Clemson and weren't looking competitive for the first 2-3 quarters of that game. Like, you could argue either of those teams should be in, but also we're talking about the last team. This is why we have a 12-team playoff. So we're talking about the 12th team getting in, not the 4th team. And either SMU or Bama, statistically, like, you've got a 1 or 2% chance to win it all. Like, we're really splitting hairs if we're going to say, well, should have been SMU or Bama. Neither of them went out and earned it either. Like, Bama, yeah, they have a tough strength of schedule, but they have 3 losses. Georgia, Texas has a tough strength of schedule. They don't have 3 losses. And so I thought the committee did a really, really good job. And at best, we're talking about very subjective on the edge things, but there's no big glaring mistakes out of what they did. It really gets down to the way these automatic buys work that I think outside of the committee's hands, just by the rules of the sport, at least as of right now, we're finding out has a really big impact on imbalancing this playoff bracket. So we've got a few questions, a few scenarios we're going to talk about to tease that out, and we'll get into some numbers as we go. Mike, the first one I know you felt pretty strongly about here over the last few days. Like, is Notre Dame officially disadvantaged for not having that conference affiliation?
So you're right. I did have a strong reaction. My initial reaction was yes. And I think that's still right. I'll go back to an episode that we had a while back where we talked about the playoff structure and how it played into Notre Dame's odds of winning a national title. And I think our opinion at the time was whether you're in a conference or you're independent, it kind of, the odds kind of work out the same. That was our opinion at the time. And a key reason for that was that if you play in a conference championship game, there's reward where you get the bye potentially, but then there's also risk where you could slip out of a potential home playoff game or potentially even out of the playoff altogether in certain scenarios. So there was a certain assumption that we had, and I think the Notre Dame administration also had, that there was an element of risk that you took on in the conference championships. So the data point that we got from this weekend, if I'm using Penn State and Texas as an example, is that they lost their games. They were, a little bit ahead of us going into this weekend, and then they remained ahead of us after losing. So the takeaway from that immediately is like, oh crap, I was expecting maybe a little bit more of a penalty if given that they had lost, and they really weren't penalized at all actually. So I think from that standpoint, that makes, if you're looking at the structure, how to what extent it optimizes Notre Dame's odds of winning a title versus other schools. To me, it seems like it's a bit of a potential disadvantage relative to schools that are in a conference. So I think that still stands. Now, I think if I make some caveats here, like, look, I think these games where the perfect scenario where these teams could lose and look about as good as possible. So Penn State lost, but it was a very close game, and they certainly had opportunities to win. Texas lost, but it went to overtime, and they certainly had chances to win too. So they lost very close matchups to top teams. So if there were a scenario where they would get dinged about as little as possible, these are those types of games. Now, so that's why I don't want to totally overreact. Now, if next year we have a similar situation, these teams lose by a couple touchdowns and they don't move down, then I would say I'm officially very concerned. But I would say, as of right now, I think it's kind of leaning me to think maybe the risk factor that we were assuming is maybe not as significant as we thought. But don't want to totally overreact yet, because we still, I think as this plays out in coming years, we'll get more data points from different types of scenarios and games.
I think these games in other scenarios could have went slightly differently and had very different outcomes. For example, if Arizona State isn't a blowout and they just win, I think Clemson is the 4.
Yeah.
And I think that if Clemson, reminder, they were up 24-7 against SMU and just kind of took their eye off the ball, and SMU made it a game. If that score stays 24-7 or 31-14, I think Bama's in. Like, you're not far off from a scenario where that coveted 5 spot would play Bama at home in the first round, Clemson in the second round. And I get it. This is not the Bama and Clemson of, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, but those are still two very, very good programs. And that would be a really tough draw. Now the 5 seed is, Clemson and Arizona State and Clemson at home, like a very, very different path. Even we're going to get to this in a second. I think the 6 seed is one of the best paths right now, even more so than the 5. And if, Texas does anything right in that game, I mean, they were dominating Georgia in the play-by-play data, and then somewhere in between questionable or just consistently close holding calls kept going against Texas. And they wind up with an interception, field goal, missed field goal on their first 4 drives. That could have just as easily been 28-0. Like, that game was, wheels were falling off for Georgia early. And I thought, were very lucky to keep that game close and competitive until they settled in over, really the second and into the third quarter. So I think if a couple of those games even just kept playing out the way they were, like, these aren't far-fetched, like, oh, if, only something would have been magically different. No, I think like 4, 5, 6 plays across 3 different football games. And we have a whole different, I don't even know where Notre Dame's 7 or 5 or 6 or whatever, but you could have wound up in a whole different scenario where you're saying no, SMU was punished for playing against Clemson and getting the doors blown off. No, like Georgia was punished for getting down big early and not climbing out of a hole. Like I think it could have went a bunch of different ways, even within these games. And the one thing we needed was, Texas to hold serve or Oregon to blow up Penn State. And we didn't get either of those. And I think that ultimately worked against us this time. I don't know if that's a permanent disadvantage. It's just the way the dice rolled in this particular game. Why does this matter? I mean, we're spending a ton of time talking about the odds. And Mike, I'm maybe going to ask you to kind of go through each of these scenarios for some of the top teams. Like, actually, let's just focus on Texas, Penn State, Notre Dame, maybe to start, because that's really where this discussion of who should be 5, 6, 7 really matters. But what we're really staring at is significantly different odds to get through the first 2 rounds, and not driven by anything that Texas, Penn State, or Notre Dame is doing, but by way of who's getting the benefit of those lower ranked teams jumping up in the seeding is a really funny thing that doesn't happen in any other playoff scenario. Like the only thing I can kind of think about is in the NFL, you could have like an 8-8 team win a really crappy division and get a home game against a wild card team. But it's not like there's like that. It's not like there's someone, has no right being in it and they jump up to the, 2 seed or the 3 seed or the 4 seed. Like there's just massive imbalance created in this reshuffling. And I think it really plays out in the odds to advance for Texas, Penn State, and Notre Dame.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So we'll start there because I think that's probably the, for Notre Dame fans, that's the most natural place to begin. So, like we said, I mean, like these teams weren't penalized because the games played out pretty much about as close as possible to where they, you wouldn't look at these games and say, oh, these teams look significantly worse than the other team they're playing. So what that meant is they stayed above us, and it's a difference in a couple spots in terms of seeding. And those couple spots, as you alluded to, Brett, they do make quite a bit of difference. So I'll start with Texas. So Texas in their path, so they got the coveted 5 seed spot. Although against Clemson, maybe not as coveted as as maybe they would have hoped. I think that's where you're hoping for more of a kind of like a fringe top 20, top 25 G5 program. In this case, they got Clemson, which is a team that's been inconsistent this year, but obviously on paper they have the capability to play at a high level. So they're 10-point favorites though against Clemson. So from Texas' standpoint, that's a matchup that they should win. That's a pretty healthy margin from an odd standpoint. And then assuming they win that in the second round, they're probably about 19-point favorites against Arizona State. So that second round is really big for them. That's where they have a very wide spread against their competition. So if you put these two together, that gives Texas about a 75% chance to get to the semis. So if you're a betting man, you would fully expect Texas to make it to the semis. Now, moving one slot lower to Penn State, they're about 9-point favorites against SMU at home. So again, a pretty healthy margin in terms of the spread. And then in that next game against Boise State, they would be about 13-point favorites. So even a bigger margin. And if I put those together like I did with Texas and calculate what Penn State's odds of making the semis would be, their odds are a little bit lower, but still pretty high, about 60%. So still, again, if you're a betting man, you think Penn State would have a good chance of making the semis. So those are the two seeds that are above Notre Dame, and those were the ones that we were hoping. We were hoping that we would jump these teams and potentially get into one of those 2 slots because those paths are pretty favorable paths to the semis. Now, when I talk about Notre Dame's odds here, you'll notice that there will be a drop off in our odds of making the semis. So for us, we have IU. It's at home. We're about 8-point favorites. Although SP Plus interestingly thinks it's a bit more like 5 or 6 points, but right now Vegas has it about 8 points. It's been fluctuating between 7.5 and 8.5, but we'll call it 8. And then where our odds really drop is that our second round draw is significantly harder than these teams. So in that second round at the Sugar Bowl, it's against Georgia. And in this case, it's pretty much a toss-up. We'd be about 1-point underdogs on a neutral field against UGA. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Vegas spread is maybe a little bit more, if they give UGA another point or so here. But anyways, that I think if you combine these two together, that tells us that we have about a 30 to 35% chance of making the semis. So for Texas, 75% chance, very likely. Penn State, 60%, not overwhelming, but it would say the majority of the time they're going to make it. For us, in most scenarios where the playoff structure lines up like this, it tells you that we're not going to make it to the semis. So just one or two spots behind Texas and Penn State, that makes a pretty massive drop off in the difficulty of our path versus their path. And look, this is pretty much all driven by opponents. So that's why we were talking about earlier in the show why we were, I guess, a bit bummed with the results of this past weekend, because we were really hoping for that 5 and 6 seed. Because just if you look at the matchups that you get, it's just much more favorable in terms of making it to the semis. And as I mentioned before, look, if we're truly a team that can win the title, if we end up being the top team this year, hypothetically, these are games that we should still go out and win. But I think Brett and I, we're both odds guys, we're both math and analytics guys, and I think from our standpoint, we're always just looking for Notre Dame to optimize their odds of making it as far as possible wherever they can. And in this case, the odds moved against us, in a way that was maybe not as favorable as we would have liked. But so I think that's, if you're focused on Notre Dame and the teams that are immediately above them, that's kind of how it shakes out. But I'm going to kick it back over to you, because I think another element that's interesting here is how the odds kind of shake out in the seeding versus some of these other teams. Some teams that have, there's some teams that don't have buys, but actually maybe have easier paths than some of the teams that do have buys.
Totally. I think this is where this actually isn't just a Notre Dame thing. Like, I'm going to come back to this as maybe a final point in this episode that I've just been thinking about real time, and went and looked up some data while you were just talking there. What if you didn't do this reshuffling? What if you said everyone gets in 12 spots, and the only thing that happens is if you're one of the top 5 conference champions, you get in. So like Clemson would get in, but they're the 12. Boise would get in, but they're just the 8 or 9, wherever they were. Arizona State pulls up, but they're the 11. Like, you don't leapfrog 10 spots. You leapfrog at most to the last 2 spots in the field. I think that is where the sport's going to go, because of not what's happened in Notre Dame. Like, Notre Dame, I think, got the short end of a stick here in terms of optimizing. But I think this is really unfair to the 2 best teams in college football right now, Oregon and Georgia. Like, they proved that they earn being the top 2 teams by winning the Big Ten and the SEC. And Oregon is going to have to go up against Ohio State, almost certainly. If not, they're going to go up against Tennessee. And I shouldn't say almost certainly. I think that Ohio State-Tennessee game could be really, really good. But against Ohio State, Oregon would be projected to be a 50-50 toss-up. Like, that literally might be a dead pick'em game. And against Tennessee, they'd be about 3-point favorites. If you net those out, regardless of their opponent, Oregon is going to average about a 50 to 55% chance to advance to the semis. Georgia similarly would be about a 1-point favorite against Notre Dame. And on a neutral field, I think Notre Dame's getting a big lift for being a home field favorite against IU. Probably only 3 or 4-point favorites against IU, Georgia versus IU. Similarly, that's maybe a 50 to 60% chance for Georgia to advance to the semis. Those are both going to be tough matchups for Georgia. So even though they have a bye, Georgia and Oregon have 50 to 60% chance of advancing to the semifinals. We just said, doing our math, that we think Penn State and Texas are more like 65 to 75% chance. That makes no sense that the teams they just beat, like Texas just lost to Georgia, and Penn State just lost to Oregon, and Texas and Penn State in the 5 and 6 spot have a better path to the semifinals than the 1 and 2 seeds that have a bye? How did we set this up? Like, this wasn't a, far off conclusion. We've been saying since August that the odds of being in that 5 seed as like the best possible spot and wanting it more than a bye was like the most obvious thing for us, since we were just discussing much, much, much more generic hypotheticals 5 months ago. And so if I'm a Oregon or Georgia fan, I'm thinking, how come I don't get any games against Arizona State and SMU and Clemson and Boise State? And I just think that's really unfair to those top programs, even Ohio State. And I get it. Ohio State lost their shot. But keep in mind, Ohio State's only losses this year, a rivalry game to Michigan and a instant thriller classic on the road at Oregon, and they absolutely beat the snot out of Penn State. And they're now having to go up against Tennessee as slight favorites, and then immediately have to go play neutral field Oregon on the West Coast. Like they're staring at a 25-30% chance. So this idea that Penn State has this awesome path of 60, 65, 70%, and that's actually the same or slightly better than Oregon and Georgia makes no sense to me. And that it's so much better than Ohio State, all because of this reshuffling. It creates an imbalance in the bracket that I don't get. Like, I just think we've got to get rid of these automatic buys and say, sure, conference championships matter to qualify, but the seeding is the seeding based on the rankings after that. No one pulls up to these automatic buys. There's just too much
Yeah.
imbalance.
Yeah, Brett. I mean, I think just if the simplest way I can put this is that it was better for Texas and Penn State to lose in the conference championship. In fact, it
Absolutely.
increased their odds of making it to the semis.
It increased their
And
odds. Yep.
yeah, Oregon, it would have been better, look, and you could say, hey, maybe Oregon should have lost. That would have increased their odds, right? Because then they would have gotten that 5 spot. I think for Georgia, it doesn't really apply for them. I think if they had dropped that game, they probably would have not gotten as favorable a seed as the 5 or 6. But it's just, yeah, it's odd. It's like you're kind of you're being penalized for winning the conference championship. I don't know, like I feel like that point hasn't. I think I've seen a few pundits mention that, but I don't think that point has. Maybe I think people are starting to catch on to it, but I would imagine as we get more and more into this, you're going to be hearing that theme and points pointing out this imbalance. I mean, honestly, just misaligned incentives. You're going to be hearing that more and more, I think, as we get further into the playoff.
In fact, so again, I'm doing this real time, and some of this math, someone can definitely go and correct me on. I'm not sure if I got it fully right, but if you wouldn't have done the imbalanced buys, as I'm going to call it, and you would have just said, "Yep, Clemson won their conference championship, so they pull up to the 12 seed." Yep, Arizona State, who did they wind up being the 11 anyways, but Arizona State automatically qualifies. The seedings would have been Oregon number 1 playing the winner of 8 Indiana versus 9 Boise State. For Oregon to beat the winner of Indiana, Boise State is probably about a 65-70% chance, depending which one of those teams win. Easier if it's Boise State, harder if it's IU. IU and Boise State would be big time underdogs against Oregon and maybe a 50-50 game between the two of them. Indiana's slight favorite. So if you start multiplying those, they probably only have about a 15 to 20% chance. So that 8-9 seed, really, really tough row. Oregon, 65-70%. UGA would have been the 2 seed playing the winner of Tennessee and SMU. Tennessee and SMU to win both of those games, beat the 50-50 game against each other and pull off the Georgia upset. Probably about a 20% chance, 25% chance. And Georgia would have had a 60 to 65%. So you'll notice, okay, better odds for the 1 and 2, tougher odds for the 7, 8, and 9. And then as you keep going, Texas would have been the 3, playing the winner of Ohio State and Arizona State. Ohio State, big time favorites against Arizona State. They probably have a 45% chance to make the semis and maybe 40, 45%. And Texas is 50%. And then that gets you to the last kind of quadrant of the back bracket, would have been Penn State in a 50-50 game playing either the winner of Notre Dame or Clemson. And Notre Dame would have been pretty big favorites against Clemson, and then a toss-up against Penn State were probably 35-40% chance to get through those 2 games. Honestly, not all that different than what we have right now. So like Notre Dame's kind of bummed that this structure didn't kind of fall in our lap, something really, really favorable. But realistically, the odds we have at about 30-35% chance to make the semis is kind of what we would get if it wasn't imbalanced. But where it smooths out is if you didn't do this reshuffling, the 1 and 2 seeds would have the best odds. The 3 and 4 seeds would have the next best group of odds. The 5 and 6 seeds would have the next best group of odds. And the 7, 8 seeds would have the next best group of odds. And everyone else in 9 through 12 would be really, really big underdogs. That makes way more sense than saying that the 5 and 6 spots is the best place to be in the bracket. Like, how did we get here?
Yeah,
They just got to look at this.
It's just, look, I think this is just a byproduct of a very heated, very delicate negotiation process where there are a lot of power plays at dynamic, a lot of compromises met. And as those compromises were made, and they came up with a structure. I don't know that they necessarily thought as much about how the incentives would align from a probability standpoint. And now we're seeing it play out, and we're realizing it. I think other people are realizing it. It doesn't necessarily make the most sense. So again, this is the first year that we're doing this, and I think people are optimistic that we'll be able to make some tweaks to this moving forward. But very odd, yeah, it's very odd that you look at the current system and you say, you know what, I'd rather be that 5 or 6 seed than the 1 or 2 seed. Just it's very counterintuitive for sure.
Absolutely. And just nothing else like it that I think is really comparable in sports. Okay, we're 31 minutes into this episode, and we haven't talked about the Indiana Hoosiers, who will be coming to South Bend. Mike, you and I are really excited. The Notre Dame ticket lottery hasn't come out yet. I don't know if I've got tickets or not. You don't know if you have tickets or not, but we both have flights and rental cars and a place to stay, and we will be in South Bend for December football. Incredibly pumped. A bunch of people coming back in our friend group. Just going to be an absolute blast. And Indiana, I get it. Not a great strength of schedule. I get it. They haven't beat anybody. They got blown out in their one big matchup against Ohio State. They only have one game with a win against a team with a winning record above 500. But ND fans shouldn't look past this team. On a neutral field, SP Plus projects ND would only be about a 2-point favorite. The Vegas line is suggesting more than that, opening up at 7.5, and since fluctuating around 8.5. SP Plus thinks that's more like 5-6. It's a really, really good football team. They're number 11 in SP Plus. They have a top 15 offense and defense, according to SP Plus in the efficiency metrics. And then on something that's not strength of opponent adjusted. So this is not adjusted for the fact that they have a weak strength of schedule. But for example, Pro Football Focus has this graded out as the number 1 overall Pro Football Focus graded team, driven by 1 being the number 2 Pro Football Focus rated quarterback in Curtis Rourke, and 2, the number 1 graded wide receiver room. So a really, really big opponent. This is, I think, a tough first round draw for Notre Dame that, I think it's a bummer. I'm curious what you think, but I don't think this is going to happen. It's not where my prediction is, but if Notre Dame does lose in this first round, I think you're going to get this big narrative of Notre Dame can't even beat IU. And I think it's really unfair more to IU than it is to Notre Dame. But I think this is a really good football team and going to be a really tough matchup in South Bend.
Yeah, I think from a perception standpoint, this is a classic Notre Dame low reward, high risk scenario where this is actually a good team. The metrics say that this is a good team, but historically, IU has not been a team that's competed at the highest level. They tend to be more at the bottom of the Big Ten. So if we win, I think the reaction is going to be, oh, of course, you guys beat IU, right? It's a good IU team, but Notre Dame is on a different tier, athletically and from a talent standpoint. So you guys just did what you should. But if we lose, we're going to hear that narrative. Oh, classic Notre Dame in the postseason. They can't even beat IU, right? Another poor performance. And I guess I don't know if this would technically count as a bowl game, but they could say, oh, if they did, they could say this is another example of Notre Dame losing another major bowl game. So I think from that standpoint, from a percent, if you care about those things, which we're all college football fans, so I think we'd be lying if we said that we didn't. But if you care about the perception side of things, I think this is, like I said, a classic high risk, low reward scenario. But again, don't want to give any. I want to give IU full credit. This is a quality team. We have to show up and play our A game. I think, again, compared to some of the other draws that we could have gotten the 5 or 6 seed, if we had gotten that, those would have been way better than this one. I do think if you're just a college football fan, this is actually a pretty interesting matchup. I think this is, an in-state Indiana battle. I definitely would have liked to have seen a Southern team have to come up to South Bend. Obviously, IU, they're very familiar with the type of weather that we have to deal with South Bend. So we're really just kind of capitalizing on the home environment, which is a big element, but the weather will not really be much of a factor in this one, unfortunately. So, but in closing, yeah, just have to bring our A game. They're a good team, certainly capable of beating us if we bring anything but our best.
Well, we'll be back on the show to, of course, deep dive the Indiana preview here in the coming days and weeks. Until we're back on the air, go Irish, beat Hoosiers.
Go Irish, beat Hoosiers.